Let me start off by telling you that I lived near a metropolitan area for a little over a year before I moved back to my small hometown. Before that, I was in college, other places, and such. I didn't interact with anyone from my hometown except my family for many years. I even deactivated Facebook for a few years. Anyways, moving forward, in the fall of 2020, I moved into a house in the small town. One cold fall night, I decided it was the perfect night to relax and get drunk with my many glasses of wine. I was chilling on the couch with my girlfriend when, all of a sudden, we heard someone knocking on the door. It was around midnight, so she immediately told me not to open the door. I immediately got up to raise the blinds on the glass part of the door, and I saw a shy girl, probably under 20, standing on our porch with a blanket and a bag. I was shocked by this because in a small town like this, there are literally no homeless people, and the town is so small that people generally have a support network when things go wrong. I badly asked her what was wrong, and she told me she was homeless and needed a place to stay. My drunk self thought this was a perfect time to fulfill my need to help the world by opening the door to let her stay in the guest room. My girlfriend immediately sat her down and started asking her questions, and her answers were pretty vague. Upon second thought, she eventually told us that she knocked on every door on the street to find a place to stay because she had a fight with her mother. So, she wasn't homeless. Also, it's weird to think a young girl would do that, considering the danger. I eventually found out she went to the same private school I went to from first grade all the way to sixth grade, except at the university extension on the same campus. We were kind of connecting by bad-mouthing the campus because it's a new school run by boomers. But then she mentioned that she had a no-contact order for sitting at the same table as someone at school. Drunk Milo didn't register that no-contact order meant restraining order. We were talking, and then she says she recognizes me from Facebook. It alarmed me, especially since I have never seen this girl before in my life, and we have an age difference of almost 10 years. She told me it was because I posted a local rental on the Facebook home sharing group. It was for my mom, who was a realtor. No Facebook, it's okay, small town. But then she tells me she knows my mom. This is alarming because my mom and I have different last names, and she doesn't have social media or any way to connect other than that. My drunk self checked in alone the next morning. Moving forward into the morning, she says she's leaving, and I ask her if she wants a ride home because it's cold outside. As I drive down the street for several miles, I realize she does live on the same street, but I would have also had to pass at least 5 developments and many rows of houses to get to my house. Was I really the only one to answer the door, or did she pick my house specifically? The next day, my girlfriend and I discussed how weird that was and how many things didn't add up. Later in the day, we come home from going to the store and see the girl in front of our house again. I panic because I am horrible with confrontation, and my girlfriend says, "You let her in the home, you deal with this." She stays in the car, and I ask the girl what's going on, and she asks us again if she can stay with us. I panicked and was asking my girlfriend to get out of the car. My girlfriend told her she didn't know if he had a gun or who he was, and that she could only stay with us if she told us everything and why she wasn't going to her house. We sat her down in the kitchen and questioned her nicely, only to get false answers. To be honest, initially, I was worried it was an abuse situation, but it turned out it wasn't. At this point, she's in our house, and we don't know how to get her out. By a stroke of luck, she says she's going to go into the dining room and will be back later. Quick, we put up signs on the front and back doors that said landlord doesn't allow additional tenants, and we continued to say she'd better go back to her mom's. It's later at night, and it's already dark at this point, and we heard knocking on the front door, then we heard knocking on the side door, then the back door. Finally, she stops. We were upstairs, and we knew it was her, so we just waited an hour. Then I went down to check because we were hungry and wanted to use the downstairs kitchen. I decided to literally take a finger and slide a blind to look through the glass doors to the kitchen, and she was there in front of me in the pitch black in my backyard. After an hour, I looked her straight in the eyes, then turned around and walked up the stairs. Time passed, and eventually she was gone. When I opened the door, we noticed she had taken the handwritten notes with her. The next day, everyone's mothers and cousins were lecturing me and laughing at me for opening the door to a stranger, which, to be honest, I would never normally do. But all of this just wasn't leaving me alone, and I needed more information. I posted something on Facebook about it, and a guy I went to elementary school with messaged me asking if it was me and cited his name because she had an obsession with him, which led to a restraining order. He advised me that she was probably harmless and not to reply to her. She hasn't been back since, and I still have no idea why she actually showed up or how she knew me. It cost me the purchase of a Ring security system, but it could have been worse. California is a small, coastal town northwest of Sacramento, with a little bit of a king feel to it. You know what I mean, that small, almost spooky town covered in fog. But it is beautiful and a big tourist attraction. People come from all over the United States to travel here. My fiancé and I decided to drive up here after I took some time off work due to stress. It was a last-minute decision, and we packed our bags in less than 10 minutes, grabbed our dog, and left. If we hadn't taken our dog, I'm sure I would have lost her. This is where I tell the story, right? It's our second day here, and we're staying at a motel that overlooks the ocean. You can watch the fog roll in during the early morning hours and watch the fishing boats come out of the harbor to get their catch of the day. It really is a beautiful thing to see. We woke up early and I was craving eggs and bacon. After we got dressed and decided where to get our fill, we headed out for our morning adventure. You see, this is where I made my mistake. I was driving down the road, and it looked like the stop at a four-way stop sign. I was wrong because as I pulled in and cut off a little Ford Ranger with a beat-up trailer and two older men driving it, I realized a little too late that I had cut them off. They put their hands up and pointed at me, but Lucy didn't even notice. I put my hands up in some sort of apologetic gesture as if to say I'm sorry. I'm just a tourist. They just stared at me. It was a redneck showdown that would make George Strait proud. I didn't think much of it and kept driving down the foggy two-lane road to breakfast. I didn't even think about saying anything to her about it. I never thought I'd see them again, and I didn't want her to complain that I can't drive. However, I was wrong. We headed back to the motel after a not-so-good but extremely expensive breakfast. We snuggled up and talked about our plans for the future and what we wanted to do in life. But halfway through our conversation, she realized that we were out of dog food for Baltazar. I agreed to go to the cute but creepy market to get a bag of candy. I kissed her on the cheek and jumped in the Navigator. I got out and made it halfway to the store before I realized I had forgotten my wallet on the nightstand. When I got back to the parking lot, I saw that same Ford Ranger with the trailer pulled out. The only difference was Frank and Boomhauer weren't inside. I don't remember seeing them here last night. I thought I walked to our door while looking over my shoulder, wondering what the odds of those idiots staying here. Then it wasn't even 2 seconds later that my heart started beating faster. The door to our motel was open, but barely ajar. It was cracked open slightly to the point where you could see a sliver of light, but nothing more. I pushed it open slowly and looked inside, but I saw nothing. Lucy and Baltazar had disappeared. It was like they had never been there at all. My heart started racing, and I dropped my keys on the ground and ran outside. My heart pounding in my chest, faster than a jackhammer in New York. I didn't see the creepy old men of the Ford truck, not even Lucia outside at this point. I was angry and frantic. Where are they? I thought, before the screams in my head were interrupted by the sound of familiar barking. I heard Baltazar barking, and I ran. I ran faster than I have ever run in my 28 years of life. I ran straight towards the main office where the sound was coming from, and that was when I saw her and our dog inside the office. She was crying, sitting on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, and her hair was standing up until she saw it was me running towards them. Lucy stood up and ran into my arms. Meanwhile, the receptionist was on the phone, wondering what had happened in the 2 minutes I was gone. This is what happened, as told by her, and it makes my blood run cold. Turns out, as soon as I left, not even 30 seconds passed, and those rednecks knocked on the door. Lucy opened it thinking it was me, that I had forgotten my wallet, which I did, and they tried to force their way into the room, saying, "You can thank your boyfriend for what's going to happen to you." As they grabbed her and covered her head mouth, those idiots didn't realize one thing, and that is that we had a dog in our back seat when I cut them off. Baltazar jumped out of bed and didn't hesitate to bite whoever was holding her. Aaron and they tried to get him off of me, but he wouldn't let go. After being bitten and realizing the noise would attract attention if they didn't leave, they ran off, and Lucy was able to run to the main office and wait for help while Baltazar followed her. I wasn't there. I couldn't protect her. If we had found a dog sitter and our plans hadn't been last minute, she might be missing right now. But my dog was there, and he did exactly what a good boy, not the best boy, would do. And that's why he's truly my best friend. If he hadn't been there, what would have happened? They would have kidnapped her, beaten, murdered, all of the above. The craziest thing is they haven't caught them yet. We filed all the reports with the sheriff. I told him what happened that morning, and the cop looked right at me and said, "You're lucky your dog was there. If she hadn't been and they had gone in with her, you could be filing a different report right now." My eyes filled with tears to listen to that. I looked at Lucy and Baltazar and thanked God for rescuing him from the pound because, in return, he rescued the love of my life when I couldn't. This is more of an urban legend story than a true story, but they say there is truth in urban legends. Isn't there? Let me know what you think. If this had happened to you, I am a psychiatrist by profession, and I often get asked about my experiences with patients. When I tell this experience, I am always encouraged to share it on the web. Since this does not include a patient as such, I feel that I can share it. I am going to keep out of this names, locations, and all personal information as well. I am going to try to make it as brief as possible. I don't think I have ever had a stranger encounter than this. There was a family of 3, a couple in their 60s and their son who was in his 30s that had moved into the neighborhood. They actually moved next door. The son seemed to be a hikikomori. If you're not familiar with this term, it basically means social withdrawal. It is an extreme avoidance of social contact and seems to be more common in adolescent males. Thus, the son was socially awkward and rarely seen. The news spread around the neighborhood, and it reached my ears that this was the case. I personally never even got a chance to meet him. I guess they moved to my area to try and get the son back in shape, so to speak. I guess it didn't work because no one ever saw him. He didn't even seem to come out of his room. I know this because I live next door. I could hear the mother yelling at her son to get up and get out of his room. I used to see her around the neighborhood, and every time I saw her, she seemed to get more and more tired. About 6 months after they moved in, there was a knock on my door. I went to open it and saw the father from the house next door standing at the door looking somber. He said to me, "Doctor, I want you to come to my house tomorrow night. I could really use your help." Although I had never done a private medical evaluation on a potential patient, I agreed. Not only would it make my home life better, as his wife's yelling at the son was irritating from time to time, but it would also help him and his family. And despite the situation, I liked his wife, and we agreed that he would go the next night. So after work, I stopped by my neighbor's house and got ready to talk to the son. The mother and father greeted me at the door and invited me in. They led me upstairs, and the mother said, "Here it is. You're in front of what I assumed was the son's bedroom." The mother started yelling at her son to open the door and such. Then the father just opened the door. The mother yelled at the son again as we walked into the room. "How long have you been sleeping? Get up and do something with your day." She threw the covers off, and what I saw almost made me fall to the floor. There was a faceless mannequin laying on the bed. She had no clothes on. The mother then turned to me and said, "It's my wife. I want to talk to you about. She can't accept the loss of our..." This happened last summer when I was heading back to the countryside to visit my grandparents. Our family would usually go see them in the summer. They lived in the middle of nowhere, in a place in Japan called Seo in Jogo Prefecture. I know it's not right to say this, but I really wasn't looking forward to it. Summers, because every time I went to see my grandparents, it ended up pretty boring. All my friends would get together, and I would just sit there reading the same books and watching boring daytime TV. I had a lot of free time, but I didn't know what to do with that time. My parents expected me to spend the day studying, which was never going to happen. The day this experience took place, they asked me to go to the store to get something. I remember it was a very hot and humid day. Even though it was hot and not very nice to be outside, I decided that I preferred being outside than inside. I had always been with my parents or grandparents and had never gone anywhere alone. I guess I was old enough to be trusted to wander around on my own that summer. With that in mind, I thought I would do a little exploring. I found a trail that led into the mountains. The trail was covered by trees and looked like it would be pretty cool and shaded. I could get out of the heat without having to go back home. I had never done much exploring, so I thought this was my chance. The mountain trail looked a lot more inviting than daytime TV. The trail wasn't difficult. The ground was pretty level. I was slowly climbing up towards the mountain. I think I had been on the trail for about 10 minutes or so when I noticed something up ahead. There were some houses off to the side of the trail to the left. I couldn't believe people lived up there in the mountains. I must leave. Of course, this is literally in the middle of nowhere, and there's nothing around. The houses didn't even seem to have gas or electricity. They were more like shacks or cabins, now that I think about it. I kept walking down the trail. It was pretty deep in the woods and pretty high above sea level. I stopped in Seco when I noticed something up ahead. There was some dirt on the trail that looked a little out of place. I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, but if you've ever played video games on the PlayStation 1 or PlayStation 2, maybe you'll understand what I'm trying to say. You know, when the game wants you to notice an object or a tile or something, they make it a slightly different or lighter shade so it stands out. Well, that's what that dirt looked like to me. I stared at that patch of dirt. It was about 2 or 3 steps in front of me. I thought about ignoring it and continuing on with my hike, but something about it seemed so out of place. It seemed as if the ground had been dug up. I was curious. It bothered me for some reason, but now that I think about it, maybe I was so interested in it because I was so bored that day. Let me tell you, I am very glad that I was bored that day. You will understand shortly. I picked up a large rock with both hands and walked over to the out-of-place patch of dirt. I dropped the rock onto the patch of dirt. I heard an unnatural sound. It sounded like the rock was hitting wood and then falling. I knew instantly what the sound was. It was a pit trap. It was a shock, but I wasn't scared. I just assumed it was some kids who had learned how to make it and they were having fun. But I felt a chill run down my spine. When I looked down into the hole, at the bottom of the hole, there were long, thin bamboo sticks cut into sharp points. They varied in height. Some were long and some were short. There were a lot of those bamboo skewers down there. The hole was very deep, too. I doubt it was dug by neighborhood kids. The creepy thing about the trap was the fact that there was no bait. It didn't seem like the purpose of the trap was to catch animals. Perhaps it was meant to catch humans. I turned on my heel and ran out of there. I wanted to run, but I was scared that if I didn't watch where I was going, maybe I'd step into one of those horrible traps. I got out of the forest safely, and I don't think I've ever been so happy to see my grandparents' house. I thought daytime TV was better than being impaled at the bottom of a trap in the forest where no one would come to save me or hear me scream. I think this is the closest I've ever been to death. I don't know what the purpose of the trap was. I was scared to say oops to my parents when I was that age, as I thought I would get in trouble for running away. I have never been back to those places. This happened when I was newly married. My husband and I went to visit his mother at her rural family home in Kuziu. He said he was from a small town, but it was smaller than we ever imagined. Another reason we went back to his hometown was because his father was in the hospital. My sister-in-law was a student, so she wasn't home to help, which left his mother practically alone at home. She didn't have a driver's license, so getting around the countryside was very difficult. She could walk to most places, and of course there were buses and taxis, but occasionally you just need a car. She needed a bunch of gardening supplies. We got to Kyushu on the Shinkansen. My husband would drive his mother in his father's car. I was planning on going with them, but I suffer from anemia, and I almost fainted on the train. When my mother-in-law saw me, she said I looked pale and said it would be best if I stayed home. I didn't care much for the idea. My husband's room had been left just as it was since he graduated from high school. Same bed, same desk, etc. I got into bed and closed my eyes. Now, I must say, I'm a deep sleeper. I experienced and slept through the Great Hanshin earthquake and came out injured. Plus, I somehow slept through a 5.0 earthquake too. I had no idea what had happened. I just turned on the TV at night, watched the news, and thought, wow, that happened. It was really shocking. So there I was, sleeping soundly in my husband's childhood bed. For a while, I guess I started to feel a little restless. I attributed it to sleeping in a different place. You know, like when you miss the comforts of home or you wake up in the middle of the night at a friend's house and you're confused, and the first thing you think is, where am I? It was kind of like that. I wasn't used to sleeping alone. So when I thought I felt movement in the bed, I immediately thought, my husband came back earlier than expected. Sleepily, I thought he saw me sleeping and felt like joining me for a little while. After a few moments, I felt something was off. He was being a little more forward, so to speak, with what he thought he could get away with at his parents' house. I was more than half awake at that point, and I knew something wasn't right. I felt something moving under the covers, under my skirt. I felt a hand trying to pull my legs apart and breathing on my bare thighs. I opened my eyes, pulled the covers back, and saw there was an old man in the bed. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He saw I was awake and immediately tried to overpower me. I want to see what a city bitch looks like. That's what he said as he tried to grab my clothes. First, I was speechless. I was in a state of daze and could not believe whatever was happening. I couldn't scream right away, but then my brain started to react. I leaned over to the nightstand, grabbed my phone, and dialed the police number. I kicked the old man with all my might, and he fell backwards out of bed. I took the opportunity and ran down the stairs as fast as I could. I heard the old man cursing from the street where I was immediately spotted by another older man who was washing his car. I was screaming. It was horrible. I screamed at the older man for help, and then I just started crying. The wife of the man who was washing his car came out and took me to her house to take shelter while she waited for the police to arrive. As I explained the situation, my husband and mother-in-law came back home. I was telling the police everything with eyes full of tears and heavy sobs. The old man, the man who got into bed with me at my mother-in-law's house, came out of the house and just walked away down the street as if nothing had happened. That didn't go too well for him because he was instantly arrested. Now that my husband and his mother had returned, they were able to tell me some things about the old man. Turned out he lived right down the street on the opposite side. He lived with his 2 children, both over 40 years old, who didn't work. He didn't work either. Apparently he had a young wife, but she didn't live with him anymore. I asked myself why. It turned out he was jealous of my husband and the life I had with me outside the small town. He told the police that since I was from the city and wore different clothes, I was glamorous and looked easy on him. He told the police that when he broke in, he hadn't committed any crime. He was just trying to find out if I was a prostitute or not. Naturally, he was taken away in a police car. We were planning on staying that night, but he didn't want to after that. I don't think it was difficult wanting to go home. Before we left, my husband and his mother informed me that the old man was a very important person in their town. I didn't care what that man tried to do. It would have been irreversible. I was fully prepared to sue that man, but they asked me multiple times to find a more amicable resolution. They were telling me they wanted a peaceful ending to the matter. I was stunned. It wasn't that simple. I couldn't do it, and they understood in the end. There was no apology, no deal, no punishment for the old man, and I cried myself to sleep that night. Is this something that happens in small towns? God, I hope not. This incident happened in the summer of 2015. I lived alone in a nice house in a small town. Every now and then, something fishy would happen. Anyway, that day at work, during a smoke break, I saw a dog get thrown from a moving vehicle on a 4-lane road during the beginning of rush hour. I was running over there, picked him up, and took him back to my place of work. Surprisingly, he wasn't hurt. Being an animal lover at heart, I decided to take him home with me until I could figure out what to do with him. I have a lot of cats and have always had them. This was my first experience with a dog that I was solely responsible for. This guy was very shy, head down, tail between his legs, nervous, just staring at me like I was about to hit him. I had no clue about the personality and tendencies of dogs. I just knew they needed to get out frequently. His first night with me, we had hung out about 15 times already since I didn't want him inside my house. I was smoking my last cigarette of the day on my porch around 10:30 at night. The dog was on a leash, resting under my chair, while I was smoking and browsing Reddit. I see a man walking down the sidewalk in front of my house. He kept looking my way before walking past. Shortly after he passed my house, he stopped, turned on his heel, and walked over. "Hey, can you tell me where the one on Church Street is?" he asked me. I told him I would look up the address on my phone, which of course was taking a minute to load. He explained to me that he didn't have a phone of his own and that he was trying to get to a friend's house, slowly approaching me the whole time. Finally showed up. "The address is exactly 2 blocks north of here, right on the southwest corner of Cross Street," I said, pointing in the direction. He kept his eyes locked on me, continuing to slowly move closer. "Do you mind if I see the map?" He smiled sheepishly. "I'm bad with directions." I stood up from my seat, pointing again. "It's really only 2 blocks up this road. Just follow the road 2 blocks, and the house will be on your left," making it very clear that I was not going to hand him my phone. "Well, can I call them? I need to let them know I'm on my way," he said, still coming closer and holding out his hand. I didn't respond. "How about sending them a text?" he insisted. "Dude, no." I started heading for my door. "Just let me see your phone." He was visibly getting angry, clearly trying to contain himself and getting too close to my porch. As a last-ditch effort to get this guy to leave, I told him, "You need to get off my lawn. My dog is protective and will tear you apart." Hell, I didn't know the first thing about this dog, much less if he had the ability to tear someone apart. I was just hoping that saying that would intimidate the guy. On cue, as if he had said the magic words, the dog sprang into action, wolf creature style from the never-ending story, emerged like a bullet from under the chair, growling, barking, and baring his teeth, almost dragging me off the porch trying to get to this guy. He sounded and acted like an 80 pounds attack dog, not a timid 40 pounds beagle. I was scared. I didn't know if the pup would turn on me. Like I mentioned earlier, at the time, I knew absolutely nothing about dogs. The dog backed up, sticking his butt against my legs, almost pushing me towards the door, as he continued to bark with his eyes fixed on the guy on the phone and baring his teeth. The guy on the phone put his hands up and backed away, stuttering something like, 2 blocks north, right? And started walking in that direction. I went inside, turned off the lights, and watched him through the window. He looked towards my house, making sure I was inside, then turned around and started walking in the complete opposite direction that I had pointed him. As icing on the cake, he pulled a phone out of his pocket and held it to his ear to make a call. The dog secured his place as a member of my family that night. He is incredibly protective of me and has scared off another suspicious guy since this incident. He is always by my side and has made it clear that he is grateful to be in a safe, loving home where he will never again be thrown like a projectile from a moving vehicle. His name is Frank, and I truly believe that night would have ended very badly for me if he had not been there. When I was younger, I lived in a small town of 100 people. Usually, every year there is a local festival in town, and all the adults come out to have dinner and party at the town hall, where they put on some performances and make fun of the year that has just passed. This usually happens in February, so there is snow, and it gets dark pretty early. When this festival is held, absolutely all the girls between the ages of 13 to 17 are busy babysitting. My 2 friends and I went out for a drive around town since you have to be 18 to go to this party. So I just drove around, taking people to the party and making some extra money. We had been driving around for a couple of hours, and of course we knew where everyone lived. Some of the adults asked us to stop by their house to make sure everything was okay and to give them a little extra peace of mind. In one of the oldest neighborhoods in the town, we were driving slowly with our low beams on. A mother that we had given a ride to before lived there. She was a widow with 3 small children, 2, 4, and 8 if I recall correctly, and her 15-year-old niece was babysitting them. It was about 10 at night when we passed through this neighborhood, which is surrounded by hills and some cliffs. My friend swore he saw something moving in her yard. We didn't think much of it and said it was probably a cat or something. We kept driving to the other end of town, but my friend in the back seat said he had a bad feeling and wanted to go back to her house and see if we could see some footprints in the snow. When we got back, we parked the car and looked over the fence, and there were fairly fresh human footprints in the snow, all of them adult-sized. We looked at each other and decided to follow the trail. The trail went through all the rooms, but near every window, the footprints headed towards the window as if someone was trying to spy. Eventually, the trail ended in the street where the snowplow had passed earlier in the night. We talked and decided whether we should go find the mother at the party or ring the doorbell to check if everything was okay. As none of the footprints led to the back door to the front door, we decided that two of us would hide in the neighborhood to watch the house, and the driver would go to the police station and pick up the mother on the way back. That was a good decision. Maybe 5 minutes after my friend left, we saw someone looking behind one of the garages, a couple houses down. He wasn't moving there. He was just sitting there with a cigarette. We watched him from a distance since he couldn't see us. Then he got up, looked around, and started sneaking up to the house where the mother lived and walked towards the back door. Without thinking about it, my friend and I ran across the 2 yards that were between where we were and the mother's house so we could catch him trying to get in through the back door. We got there just in time. He was trying to open the door when we yelled at him. "What the hell are you doing?" He ran off and we followed him. He ran down the street to gain speed, but we were both athletic, so this was the most intense moment of our life. I remember all I was thinking about was not slipping and losing momentum. The end of the street was coming up, and the next turn would be a 90-degree turn to the right. So instead of braking, I jumped out of the street to intercept him after he lost speed taking the turn. My calculation was wrong, and he managed to take the turn without losing much speed. I spent a lot of energy running in the snow, which was a foot deep, and I knew I would have to slow down. I was still about 10 meters behind him, but my friend was closer and was catching up to him. When my friend realized that he could kick his feet and make him fall, he did. He fell, and it was the fastest stop ever. He hit his head on the frozen ground and was knocked unconscious while on his back, and there was a shallow crunching noise. I was terrified. A million questions were going through my head. Was he dying? What if it was just some relative making a joke? Why did we chase him? In the meantime, my friend checked his pocket, and we found a strong sedative and a broken camera. Luckily, the driver arrived minutes later with the mother and the police. Then the ambulance arrived and took him away. The next day, they took us in for questioning at the police station. The boss told us he was a known predator and that we had definitely saved the day and probably more kids. The fall he took when he fell caused him to bleed in his brain, and he was no longer able to wipe his butt. We told him the story, and when my friend said that I had tripped him, the boss stopped typing and said, "Are you sure you tripped him? What I see is that you 3 heroes caught a lone predator in the act." And as he ran away, he fell and hit his head. He looked at us and nodded with a soft smile. But thinking back, this perv must have planned the whole thing. Knowing when the festival was, knowing that she was a single mother, picking out the house. It gives me the creeps. I'm going to tell you why I love cats, or well, one of the many reasons why I love cats. I work about 1.5 miles from my house in a pretty small town. It's very walkable, so I never drive. About half a year ago, I finished working around 1 a.m. There's really no one out after 8 p.m. here. So, the park by which I walked was completely deserted. I live in one of the safest countries in the world, so it's easy to forget how vulnerable I still am as a petite woman. I honestly didn't feel uncomfortable at any point on my walk until I turned the corner, passing some basketball courts near my house. I was still about 2 minutes from home, and this stretch of my path was completely dark. The moon was huge that night. Well, I had welcomed its light at the beginning of my walk, but in the absence of streetlights, it actually made everything look pretty creepy. I've walked this path hundreds of times, but that night, something felt off. I'm not a fearful person at all, but I was really nervous all of a sudden. I saw a van in the parking lot next to the courts with the side door open. I picked up my pace and kept it in my field of vision. Normally, there are cars in the parking lot. I live in a tourist town, and backpackers often sleep in their vehicles to save money. However, I'd never seen one with the door hanging open like that in the middle of the night. I was so focused on the van that I didn't notice the man who came out of the trees near the courts until he was about 30 feet behind me. He was walking fast, and there was no doubt he was heading straight for me. I didn't know what my next action should be. Screaming wouldn't do much good. I was still too far from any residence. I normally carry a glass water bottle with me for protection, but I had left it at work that night. My phone was dead. Everything I knew I shouldn't do, I did. And as dumb as I feel writing this, I hesitated to run on the slim chance that he didn't have bad intentions. I've generally outgrown this mindset, but there is still a strong part of me that resists the idea of making anyone feel uncomfortable or embarrassed. I also hate showing men that I'm afraid of them because even if they hurt me, I would rather not give them the satisfaction of seeing my fear. Plus, I knew I couldn't outrun him. I also overthink everything. I saw a small dark blur moving across the library parking lot at the back of the courts. I didn't even realize what it was. The whole situation was so unreal. The guy was now behind me, and judging by his steps, he hadn't changed direction. I quickened my pace, pulled my keys out of my purse, and slid them in. Suddenly, it all made sense. The stain was Hannibal, the big black cat that often accompanied me home on the stretch after the park that night. He was doing that weird cat run where he crouches low to the ground with his ears back. I got the impression he was angry, but he was moving too fast for me to see his face clearly. As he walked past me, I kept walking, but the heavy footsteps were now getting further away. I didn't dare look back and kept moving quickly. Hannibal was suddenly at my side, still crouched, stopping every few steps to look back and hiss. Then he did that weird cat run to catch up with me. He walked with me all the way home like he had done so many times before, but I had never seen him behave like that. As we approached my door, he visibly relaxed and let himself fall on his back. I convinced him to enter the gate before giving him some huge hugs and some head touches. I stopped walking home alone at night, and I would still see my sweet cat friend often. However, I never saw him behave that way again. Hannibal moved away 3 months ago. I still miss my little friend, and I often think about how strange that night was. I wish I would have turned around to watch him chase the guy away. I've heard so many stories about dogs protecting people, but rarely about cats. My own little kitty, Hannibal, I would never do something like what Hannibal did. Parking lot lurker, let's not meet again. For as long as I can remember, I've always felt like something didn't quite fit in my town. I grew up in a small town in the south of Terra, where everyone knew each other and rumors flew faster than the leaves in autumn. Life in a place like this has its advantages. Tranquility, security, and a sense of community that, in theory, makes you feel part of something bigger. But in my case, that same community that was supposed to be a refuge always seemed a little unsettling to me. My town was quaint, almost straight out of a postcard. Red brick houses with small, well-kept gardens, an old church with a bell tower that dominated the horizon, and the main street lined with shops that seemed to have existed since time immemorial. At first glance, everything seemed perfect, but there was something in the atmosphere that made me uncomfortable, something I couldn't put my finger on. When I was a child, I used to think that my discomfort was due to my own shyness. I was a reserved child, the type that preferred to get lost in a book than go out and play with others. But as I grew up, I realized that it wasn't just my character that made me feel out of place. There was something else, something in the way that people looked at me, especially the elders of the village. The looks, I remember those looks so clearly, as if I were seeing them right now. They weren't looks of open disapproval or hostility. They were more subtle, almost as if they were observing something that seemed strange to them, something that they didn't quite understand or accept. It was difficult to explain, but from a very young age, I noticed that the eyes of the older people in the town rested on me with a kind of weight. It wasn't the normal curiosity that an adult can have towards a child, but something darker, almost as if each look carried a silent judgment. One of the first times that I noticed this was during a visit to the corner shop with my mother. I was about 7 or 8 years old, and I remember we were buying sweets for a party at school. While my mother was talking to the owner of the shop, an old lady who had always seemed kind to me, I noticed that the lady, whose name was Mrs. Whitaker, was looking at me in a strange way. Her eyes, normally warm and friendly, had a different shine, almost of pity. I felt uncomfortable, as if I was doing something wrong, although I didn't know what I could do. When we left, the discomfort stayed with me, but I didn't know how to express what I had felt, how to explain that I felt judged for no apparent reason. As I got older, those looks didn't go away. In fact, they became more frequent, and not just in Mrs. Whitaker's shop. The old ladies who gathered on the park benches, the old men who spent the afternoons at church or in the main square, all seemed to have that same way of looking at me. At first, I tried to ignore it to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but it wasn't easy to get rid of that feeling, especially when I experienced it almost daily. The town, yes, I had a kind with a mysterious air, although I didn't understand it at that time. There were stories, of course, of supposedly haunted houses and dark secrets that were told from generation to generation, but I never paid much attention to them. However, over time, I began to wonder if those looks had something to do with those old stories, if there was something in my family that I didn't know. I remember a summer afternoon when I was about 10 years old that stayed in my memory. I was playing in the park with some friends, and during a break, we sat on a bench to eat ice cream. On the other side of the park, a group of old women were chatting under the shade of a tree. One of them, a small, hunched woman who always wore a wide-brimmed hat, stared at me and smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was as if she knew something about me, something that I didn't know. Despite the summer heat, I felt a chill. I mentioned to my friends what I had noticed, but they laughed and told me I was being paranoid. For them, I was just another old woman from the town, someone who had nothing better to do than watching the children play. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind that look. That same night at dinner, I couldn't help but ask my mother if she knew the woman from the park. My mother looked at me strangely and told me yes, that it was Mrs. Ellis, a neighbor who had lived in the town all her life. When I told her that she had been looking at me in a strange way, my mother simply shrugged her shoulders and told me not to give it any importance, that old people were like that sometimes, especially if they were alone or bored. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I saw Mrs. Ellis or any other old woman in the town, I felt that same chill. I began to avoid certain places, and when I couldn't do it, I tried not to meet eyes with anyone. However, even though I tried to ignore it, I couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. It was as if there was a dark cloud over me, one that I couldn't see but that was always present. Time passed, and although the looks and the uncomfortable smiles didn't disappear, I learned to live with them. However, when I turned 14, something changed. I began to notice that it wasn't just the looks that worried me, but there had always been rumors and gossip in the village too. But I had never cared. However, suddenly, I started to feel like those whispers had something to do with me or, more specifically, my family. One afternoon after school, I was at the grocery store buying some items for my mother. As I walked through the aisles, I heard a couple of older women talking to each other. I didn't pay much attention at first, but when I heard my grandfather's name, Arthur, I stopped dead in my tracks. I hid behind a shelf, trying to listen without being seen. "It's a shame, really," said one of the women, an old woman with a wool hat. "I always knew there was something strange about that man." "Yes, but nothing could ever be proven," answered the other, a shorter woman in a gray coat who looked like she had seen better days. "No, but that doesn't mean he wasn't guilty. The mothers of those children never got over what happened." My heart was pounding as I tried to process what I was hearing. What were they talking about? What did my grandfather have to do with missing children? I wanted to hear more, but at that moment, one of the women saw me and immediately stopped talking. The other turned around and, upon seeing me, both stayed silent, watching me with those same eyes that had always worried me. Quickly, I paid for my purchases and left the store, but the words of the women echoed in my head. What did they mean? My grandfather had been suspected of something. Why had no one told me anything? That night, I went to bed early, pretending to be tired, but in reality, my mind was spinning. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had heard. What did it mean? Was it possible that my grandfather, the reserved and serious man I knew, had been involved in something so horrible? My parents didn't mention anything at dinner, which only increased my curiosity. Was it possible that they didn't know anything either? Or was it something that was simply not talked about at home? During the following days, I tried to find out more, but every time I tried to approach one of the old women in the town, they would change the subject or quickly walk away. It seemed like everyone knew something, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Finally, a couple of weeks later, I decided that I couldn't continue ignoring what was happening. I needed answers, and the only person who could give them to me was my mother. So one night after dinner, I found her in the living room, reading a book. I walked over and bluntly asked her, "Mom, what do you know about Grandpa and the missing children?" My mother looked up, surprised at my question. At first, she didn't seem to understand what I was talking about, but then her expression changed. I could see the worry in her eyes, as if she had feared this moment for a long time. "Paul, it's an old story, something that happened many years ago, before you were born. It's not something we usually talk about, but I want to know," I insisted, feeling the urgency in my voice. "I want to understand, why do people in town look at me like that? Why do they talk behind my back?" My mother looked at me for a long moment, as if she was evaluating whether she should tell me the truth or protect me from it. Finally, she seemed to make up her mind, and with another sigh, she began to speak. "When I was young, in the 70s, there was a series of disappearances in town, little children all under 10 years old. It was a terrible time. We were all scared. The police investigated but could never find the culprit. However, there were rumors that pointed to your grandfather." I froze. It was what I was afraid to hear, but at the same time, I needed to know more. "Why were they pointing at him?" I asked with a dry throat. "I don't know for sure," my mother answered, avoiding my gaze. "They said that they had seen him near the places where the children disappeared, but there was never any evidence. Your grandfather always denied any involvement. The police interrogated him several times, but they never found anything that incriminated him." There was a long silence after that. I didn't know what to think. On the one hand, I couldn't believe that my grandfather, the man I knew, could be a monster. But on the other, what if the rumors were true? And if the reason why they looked at me that way was because they saw in me the shadow of a murderer? "Mom, do you think Grandpa did it?" I asked finally with a trembling voice. My mother didn't answer immediately. She looked towards the window, as if she was searching for the right words. But in the end, she only said, "I don't know, Paul. I never knew." After that conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about my grandfather and what had happened. In those years, my mother's words had answered some of my questions, but they had also opened many more. How had my family been able to move on with such a shadow dark about them? And how was I to deal with this new cone? My grandfather, Arthur, was a reserved and serious man. I didn't see him often, as he lived on a farm just outside of town, but every time I did, I couldn't help but look at him differently. I remember one time shortly after I had spoken to my mother, when I accompanied him to the farm to help him with some chores. We were in the shed putting away some tools when I realized how quiet everything was. Only the creaking of the wooden boards under our feet broke the silence. My grandfather was not a man of many words, but that day, his silence seemed almost disturbing to me. As we worked, I couldn't help but observe him more closely. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with hair that had once been black as coal but was now completely white. His face was furrowed with deep wrinkles, but his blue eyes, although dull with age, were still penetrating. Despite his advanced age, he moved with an energy that did not seem to have diminished with the years. At one point, I approached him as he was hunched over a broken tool. I breathed deep and decided to ask him, "Grandpa, have you ever been in trouble with the police?" He paused for a second, not looking at me, and then continued working as if he hadn't heard the question. But I knew he had heard it. "These are not topics to talk about, Paul," he finally said in his deep, raspy voice. "What happened in the past stays in the past." That was the end of the conversation. I didn't bring it up again, and neither did he. However, his answer only increased my suspicions. Why did he avoid talking about it? What was he trying to hide? The weeks that followed were difficult for me. On one hand, I tried to continue with my normal life. I went to school, went out with friends, and helped out at home. But on the other hand, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had discovered. I began to investigate further, looking for any information that could shed light on my grandfather's past. In the town library, I found some old newspaper files that talked about the disappearances. The stories were disturbing. Children who disappeared without a trace, families torn apart, and a community that lived in constant fear. My grandfather's name did not appear in the articles I found, but there were mentions of an unidentified suspect, someone the police believed lived in the village. I also spoke to some older people trying to get more information, but most were reluctant to talk about it. Some simply denied knowing anything, while others told me it was better not to stir up the past. However, a couple of old people, perhaps tired of carrying the weight of silence for so many years, opened up to me. Mr. Jenkins, an old friend of my grandfather, was one of the few who agreed to talk to me. I found him in his house, sitting in a threadbare armchair with a cup of tea in his hand. Arthur and I were friends for many years, he told me, his gaze lost in his memories. But after what happened with those children, everything changed. I asked him what he meant by that, and he sighed before continuing. Your grandfather was always a reserved man, but I never thought he was capable of something so horrible. However, people started talking. They said they had seen him near where one of the children disappeared, but when the police went to look for him, they found nothing. Arthur denied everything, of course, and the investigation got nowhere, but the people of the town, he never forgot it. From then on, everyone looked at him askance, and he became more and more isolated. I asked him if he thought my grandfather was guilty, but Mr. Jenkins just shrugged. I don't know, boy, I never did, but after everything that was said, I couldn't go on seeing him the same way. No one could. As I continued to dig, I realized I was entering dangerous territory. Each new detail I discovered about my grandfather plunged me further into despair. I was not only questioning his past, but also my own, my identity, and what it meant to be a part of this family. One afternoon, after spending hours at the local library, I came home and headed to the attic. It was a place we rarely went up to, filled with dusty boxes and forgotten items. As I rummaged through old photo albums and outdated clothes, I found one box that caught my eye. It had no label, but it looked different, as if it was hidden on purpose. I opened it carefully, trying not to stir up too much dust, and found a collection of newspaper clippings, all dated in the 1970s. From the 70s. At first, I didn't understand why my mother would keep something like that, but as I read on, my heart began to pound. The article spoke of a series of disappearances that had taken place in our town and nearby villages, children all under the age of 10 who had disappeared without a trace. I remember a shiver running down my spine as I turned page after page. The articles recounted the panic that had gripped the community and how the police had searched for the person responsible without success. But what really took my breath away was one article in particular, where it mentioned that the prime suspect in those years had been my grandfather, Arthur. The article detailed how the police had questioned my grandfather several times but could never find enough evidence to arrest him. It was mentioned that he had been seen near the places where the children disappeared, but that he had always had an alibi. However, the suspicion never went away, and although the case eventually went cold, the stigma remained. That night, it was impossible for me to sleep. The words of the newspaper resonated in my mind like a constant echo. Prime suspect, Arthur. No conclusive evidence. Mysterious disappearances. I couldn't believe that my own grandfather was involved in something so horrible. I got out of bed several times, pacing the room like a caged lion. How was it possible that my family hadn't told me anything about this? It was true what the newspapers said. Finally, the next morning, I couldn't take it anymore, and I confronted my mother. At first, she tried to evade the subject, but when I insisted, she finally gave in. She told me that indeed, in the 70s, my grandfather had been suspected of kidnapping several children in the town. However, the police could never prove anything. There was not enough evidence to arrest him, and over time, the case went cold, although the disappearances were never solved. My mother confessed to me that this was a taboo subject in the family, something that had always been kept silent to avoid staining our name. My grandfather, according to her, was a complicated man, marked by a difficult childhood and a war that had changed him forever. But when I asked her if she believed he was guilty, she didn't know what to say. Her silence was more eloquent than any words. From that day on, everything changed for me. Every time I saw my grandfather, I couldn't help but feel a knot in my stomach. Could a man be so cold as to commit such atrocious acts and continue with his life as if nothing had happened? I began to observe him more closely, looking for any sign, any clue that could give him away. But Arthur was an impenetrable rock and never let on anything that could confirm my suspicions. What hurt me the most was realizing that the fairy tales that had so disturbed me during my childhood had a reason to exist. The elders of the town, especially those old ladies, knew or at least suspected the truth about my grandfather. That's why they looked at me with those eyes full of pity and fear. In their minds, I was the descendant of a monster, a shadow that walked among them, oblivious to the reality that surrounded him. I decided that I could not continue living in ignorance. I needed to know the truth. Although I was terrified of what I might find, I began to investigate on my own, talking to some of the elders of the town, trying to get more information. Most refused to talk about the subject, closing the door in my face or changing the topic quickly. But a couple of them, maybe tired of carrying the weight of silence for so many years, opened up to me. What they told me was chilling. Apparently, my grandfather had been seen near the places where some of the children disappeared. However, there were never direct witnesses who could confirm that it was he who kidnapped them. The elders spoke of him as a lonely man who never quite fit in with the community, someone who was always a little different. Some even mentioned that he had had a difficult childhood marked by abuse and trauma that could have led him to commit those crimes. But it was all speculation, rumors fueled by fear and mistrust. On one occasion, I decided to go back to the attic in search of more clues. I remembered that my grandfather used to keep some of his belongings there, in an old leather suitcase that was almost never opened. After searching for a while, I found it in a corner covered in dust. The suitcase was locked, but the lock was so old that I was able to open it with a couple of tools. Inside, I found several things: yellowed letters, black and white photographs, and a couple of personal items. However, what caught my attention the most was a diary hidden at the bottom of the suitcase. When I opened it, I realized it was my grandfather's diary, written during the years in which the disappearances occurred. The first pages of the diary were quite normal, full of reflections on the day-to-day life on the farm and on the problems of everyday life. But as it progressed, the tone changed. My grandfather began to talk about the disappearances, not directly, but mentioning them. They were important, however. There was something about the way he described them that made my hair stand on end. In one entry in particular, he mentioned how the people of the town would never understand what it takes to survive in such a cruel world. He didn't say much else, but that phrase haunted me for days. What did he mean by that? Was he justifying something, or was he just expressing his frustration with life in general? As my investigation progressed, I realized I was entering into dangerous territory. Each new detail I discovered about my grandfather plunged me further into despair. I was not only questioning his past, but also my own, my identity, and what it meant to be a part of this family. One night, after weeks of insomnia and recurring nightmares, my mother sat me down and asked me to stop investigating. There are things that are better not to know, she told me with tears in her eyes. But I couldn't let it go, not after everything I had discovered. I told her I needed answers, that I couldn't live with the uncertainty of not knowing if my grandfather was or wasn't a murderer. Finally, my mother confessed something to me that left me frozen. On one occasion when I was a child, I had found my grandfather in his workshop cleaning what appeared to be bloodstains on the floor. When she asked him what had happened, he answered her coldly and sharply, telling her not to ask questions and to forget what she had seen. Since then, my mother had lived with that memory, not daring to share it with anyone, not even my father. The revelation left me stunned. I realized that although my grandfather had been able to hide his secrets for all these years, the truth had always been lurking, waiting to be discovered. My mother, like me, had lived with fear and uncertainty, not knowing if her own father was a monster or simply a man marked by hard times. The discovery of this dark secret was a devastating blow to me. It felt like everything I had known, everything I had believed in, was crumbling around me. My grandfather, the man I had known all my life, could be a monster, a child murderer. How was I supposed to move on with my life, knowing this? But despite the horror and revulsion I felt, I knew I couldn't change the past. What my grandfather would or wouldn't have done didn't define who I was. It was his burden, not mine. I decided the best way to honor the potential victims and find some inner peace was to move on with my life, but never forgetting what I had discovered. I moved away from the town, avoiding the glances of the elders, who I now understood perfectly. I focused on my future, on my studies, and on building a life for myself, a life that wasn't marked by the sins of the past. Although I never forgot what I had discovered, I learned to live with it, accepting that although I couldn't change my family's legacy, I could decide how it would affect my own path. Over time, the weight of what I had discovered began to diminish. Although I never stopped thinking about my grandfather and what he had been able to do, I learned to move on. I found solace in the idea that although I couldn't change the past, I could make sure it would not repeat itself in my life. I strove to be a good and honest person, someone who treated others with respect and compassion, something that, in my heart, I knew my grandfather had failed to do. The town also moved on, as it always had. The rumors about my grandfather faded with time, and the glances that once weighed me down began to lose their intensity. But in the back of my mind, there will always remain that disturbing memory, that dark truth that I discovered. On a rainy afternoon, I forever changed the way I saw my family and myself. In the end, although my life was irrevocably changed by what I discovered, I learned that the past, no matter how dark it is, does not have to define us. Each of us has the power to choose who we want to be, and I chose to be someone who is defined by their own actions, not those of their ancestors.